This is Scott McDonald at drdemographics.com. And today we're going to be talking about the demographic imperatives that specialists are under. Now, we tried doing this one earlier this morning, and frankly, we had a little technical difficulty. I blame the snow, but don't get me started. So the point really is, in order to find a perfect place to put a practice when you're a specialist, you're looking for very different criteria than if you're a general practitioner. And this goes not just in, say, dentistry or in general healthcare. It makes a big difference between the nature of a specialty practice and one that is a general practice, because there are different priorities and different calculations that one needs to make. Now, I want to go through some of those calculations. I'm not going to be able to identify what places are going to be particularly good for one particular type of specialty because, well, the demographics based upon where to put a practice are going to be different. Some places are going to be spectacular for one type of practice and just have the kiss of death for those that are not. So just recognize that if we are doing a report for you and you happen to be an endocrinologist, the differences between locations based upon that are not just based upon where there's competition, but rather where there's a difference in the demographic character of the population. It isn't on just whether an area is growing, it's what type of growth that you're going to find within the area that will make it viable and desirable or not. So let me get into my little screen sharing here. And we'll talk about more specifically what I mean. Now, I'm calling this the demographic priorities for specialists. And as I said, and I repeat, look, specialty practices and general practices are just different. They just are. And what makes one place good for one is going to make it bad for another. It used to be, by the way, back in the old days when I was first starting, you would always expect that specialists would want to be as close to general practitioners as possible because GPs were the source of most of the referrals. You would never think about going to a specialist without going to a GP first. But I'm going to talk to you about the quasi-specialists and how they're influencing the market and what's different. Now, Dr. Demographics is all about knowing where to move, and where to start a practice or a business, move your efforts, and get the most out of your location. Ultimately, we're looking at trends. Now, for specialists, the trends are different. And in fact, there are a lot of them that are really changing right now. Now, when it comes to evaluating sites for specialists, don't assume that that which works for a general practice is going to be what you want, because that simply is not true. And the difference between what's good for one and not good for another is becoming even greater and more complex. Most demographers can't tell you the difference. Now, I'm going to be very blunt. We have lots of competitors who do healthcare demographics, particularly those that are in general practice. So, for example, there are lots of companies that do dental demographics. For general dentists, that's just very easy to do. When it comes to specialty work, they don't like to do that because it's much more complicated. And they don't want to go out on a limb because they don't have the research muscle to make it happen. First and foremost, the priorities and underlying assumptions between a specialty and a general practice are radically different. Radically. With general practices, competition ratios are quite important. So, for instance, if you're a general dentist, you'll say, how many GPs are there within a 3 to 5 mile radius? Well, yeah, you may get that number. You'll generally find in most parts of the country, there are one, let's say, a general practice within 1,400 population. 1 to 1,400 is pretty average in most suburban areas. However, it's going to dramatically change when you get into an urban area, or especially when it's rural. And of course, there's a difference between practices. There's a limit on the number of providers per population, and this will tend to make a difference as to what is a viable site versus one that isn't. Now, GPs are more of a commodity. I know that is not a nice thing to say. Some people are offended by it. But the difference between one general practice, and this goes for medicine and dentistry, optometry, and whatever, tends to be less when you're in general practice, the differences, than when you have a specialty practice. This is especially true in veterinary practice. A small animal practice is not the same thing in all circumstances, and I'll explain a little as I go along. Just remember the differences between specialists, one specialist and another, is going to dramatically change, and that which is viable depends upon the age and other factors regarding what they're offering. Now, specialists tend to cluster. You have to understand this. You actually find far more group practices in a specialty practice. So 5 or 6 oral surgeons may practice under the same roof, and they would not feel overcrowded. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But it's also true in medicine as well. Group practices are much more common with specialists than they are in general practice. So you certainly shouldn't freak out if you've got another guy who happens to be offering similar circumstances in a geographically nearby place. So there's a cluster. Specialists will tend to cluster around a hub, such as a hospital or a major population center, large employer, often around interstate freeways, intersections where they come together. You're going to find far more specialists, and it's because people are willing to drive further to get to a specialist than they are to a general practice. GPs have a small geographic radius from which they draw. That's important. Don't forget that. Now, specialists tend to thrive within groups, and there are some reasons why. And one of the biggest ones is the equipment is often much more expensive. It's more patients in a specialty practice, so they've got to have a higher investment. An MRI costs a lot. And if you happen to have lots of doctors within the same practice using the same equipment, it becomes more cost efficient to spend a large amount of money on that. The geographic radius is therefore often much larger for many reasons. So for a general practice, people will tend to travel between 5 and 7 minutes to get to a general practice. For specialists, they will travel usually 10 minutes to a half an hour to get there. And that is going to be a general truism, but there are some specialty practices that are an exception. And one example I give is a pediatric endocrinologist. You may travel an hour or more to get there. Orthopedists do the same thing that are highly specialized, but those that are in general practice won't do that. So the investment in the equipment is one reason, but the other reason is there just aren't as many people within that area, and therefore people are willing to travel. Now, there are special trends that I want you to be aware of, and one is the quasi-specialist practices. And you may say, I've never heard of a quasi-specialist practice. Well, I'm going to categorize them, and this is my own definition. Endodontists, dermatologists, orthopedists, optometrists, and orthodontists, I put in that category. That is not to demean what they're doing. They are really important. Please don't take that badly. But the reality is, and we'll take dermatology, for example, there are a large number of general practitioners who provide Mohs surgery or do other dermatology services. And it's not because the people doing those things aren't true specialists. Endodontists, for example, let's talk about root canals. A lot of people do root canals who are general practitioners because, well, depending on the type of tooth, they'll say it's not a difficult case. There may be some molars that are going to be hard, and they will refer that out, but they may kind of see single or double canal surgeries as being it's pretty straightforward and not too hard. So general practitioners will often poach upon these specialty services. Orthodontists have known for a long time. Invisalign has been putting out a range of services, of products that are intended for general dentists to use that are going to straighten teeth. Now, granted, some malocclusions are not going to be appropriate for all cases. I think everybody knows that. But there are some simple cases that people go, how hard is it to just make a slight adjustment here? I'm not talking orthodontics, but I am saying this is an exception, and this happens in several services right now. Now, I always ask my doctors to ask themselves the question, are they really depending upon referrals from other doctors, or are they getting their patients directly? if they're getting patients directly, they're going to generally fall within the quasi-specialist practice category. Now, that isn't true 100% of the time, but I'm just telling you, a lot of people say, do I really need to see a general practitioner first in order to get the referral? And if they don't, they're going to kind of put the word out, I can handle it. You can come directly to me. That is cutting out the heart of a lot of specialists. I recognize it, and it's not going away soon, but it's a truth that I want you to be aware of. It's changing. And part of the reason is Medicare and others are wanting to pay less money to people who are not true specialists for the same kind of treatment. So they'll put them in their referral panel and say, oh, we don't have to pay out so much money. And this has been a burden upon specialists as well. I think you understand the situation, but it has a lot to do with the locations that are appropriate for specialists, particularly these quasi-specialist practices. It's a moving target, and it's getting more complex every year. So what Medicare and other private panel insurance companies are willing to pay in network or out of network or whatever is affecting where you put your practice. Just be aware of it, and we track that. Now, closed panels or networks are not set in stone. It used to be that to get into a panel, a closed panel, you had to put your name in and get approved, and your fees were reviewed and your procedures were reviewed. But a lot of times, insurance companies are being a little bit more flexible, especially those that are in public assistance funding. And so I'm just saying where you put a practice is going to depend upon the population demographics. They're going to fit for that quasi-specialist practice. Now, where deciding to put a specialist can operate is not a simple matter. As I said, used to be a time in which going to a medical facility was terrific because there are lots of people in theory who are in your referral network because they were right there in the same complex. But unfortunately, as you will realize, a lot of these people are becoming your competitors, not your referral base. And because of that, it's becoming more difficult to justify putting a specialty practice in a pill hill, where there's a lot of other practitioners who are general practitioners, specifically because they may hurt your practice, not help it. Now, much of the world has patient territories. When I've lectured in Europe, for example, it became a big thing in socialized medicine to look at ziekenfunds, which was in Holland, for example. They'd had the ziekenfunds. You couldn't get funded as a specialist by putting your practice too close to other practitioners. So the government would decide where you could go if you wanted to get government assistance money. And to a degree, that same thing happens in Great Britain with the National Health Service. They're determining where you can go. And this is especially an issue when it comes to specialty practice. That's all I'm saying. Now, it's not true in the United States, but I think it's going to get there. I think some states that have a lot of motivations towards socialized medicine are going to say, you can't be in this location because we already have providers there. That's kind of goes against a lot of things of American medicine, but it's a truth. Now, in some places, progressive assessments may occur, but it's already happening on income. And I'm saying the government will say, because you're in a certain location, we will charge you more in taxes because you make more money. It's a progressive tax strategy. In short, you're taxed on a higher rate when you have higher income, and you all know that. But the types of practice, in other words, being a doctor, could also fall within this situation, particularly as the government becomes more involved in socialized medicine, which it is. You all know that Obamacare made big inroads into saying where you could and could not practice. I won't get into the politics of this. I'll simply say you got to be aware of it, and I know we are too. Now, the demand for specialists is highly dependent on demographics, much more than it is on general practices. General practices take a wide cross-section of population, but in specialty practices, they're looking for certain indicators that say, is this service in demand in this area? Specialist demographics are primarily built around age. If you know the age, it's the key demographic factor that will determine whether a specialist practice of one particular type will work or not. Now, services tend to carry an optimum age that will determine the need of those services within a community. So obviously, pediatric and geriatric age groups are important, but remember there are other factors, including gender. And I know that there's some people say, well, I define gender by how I identify. But physiologically, that's not true. You've got a prostate, or you've got, well, let's just say man parts or lady parts, and that will determine a lot of the needs that exist within specialist services. Now, orthodontists should seek to look for age group, say 10 to 14-year-olds. Pediatric or interceptive orthodontics, you're looking for a different age group. But there's also adult orthodontics and other treatment modalities that make it more reasonable for adults to seek care. Therefore, age and other factors are going to matter more. The educational attainment of parents, the housing type, the employment type, and family size are relevant, and they're important to determine whether a specialist practice can make it or not. These are just a few of the factors, not all of them, that will determine if your particular specialty will make it or not. Commute times and proximity to schools, for example, are going to matter for pediatric and adolescent care. Obviously, it's not going to matter in geriatric care, but being close to a retirement community, 55 plus, is going to matter. And therefore, proximity to the population that has its own natural clusters is important. Remember, the number of dental GPs is a counter indicator for many specialists in dentistry. So what I'm saying is, just because you have a lot of GPs isn't a good or necessarily bad thing, but it can be an indicator that you got to have care. Because if all of those GPs are struggling to survive with production and collections, the first thing to go is the referrals to specialists. I think you get that. So that's one of the things we track. Each healthcare specialty has a sweet spot in terms of demographic character. Therefore, gender, income, educational attainment, referral base, and hubs, employment types, housing types, etc., are going to make it a better or worse location for specialist practices. That's not going to be true in general practices. When you can serve anybody, well, you can be pickier, but in choosing who you're going to care for. But I just have to tell you, what we track for specialist practices is important for you to know. Now, while growth is generally a good thing to know, it has to be the right type of growth to be good. Not all growth is the same. Some growth will be a better indicator for your practice success or not. So we have to know what type of growth, not just that there is growth going on. Doctor Demographics can tell you if the place you're considering is favorable or not, and it may not be. Now, you may think, well, gee, I don't want to know bad news. Yeah, you kind of want to. And what we track is not just the number of competitors, but the character of the population you're seeking to serve. And that's really what you need to know. There may be a better place for you to practice. And if you identify a region, we can tell you where those places might be. Now, the answer is the Best Sites report. I created this report in order to give you 5 locations within the region that you're looking at. It's a little bit more expensive than the practice viability report, but it's definitely a thing that will serve you well. We have to look for what's best for your specialty. If you want to talk to us, info@drdemographics.com is where to email us. Please look at drdemographics.com. We offer all of the demographic reports we have for all of the healthcare specialties. And yes, we do know the difference between endodontists and endocrinologists. I'm just saying. I'm Scott McDonald. Give us a call. Let us know how we can help you to find the perfect place to practice. Thanks for watching.